On the surface, Jake Miller's life seemed perfect. In the small, cozy town where he lived with his first wife, Katie, and their two children, Jake was the epitome of a respectable family man. He was polite, attentive, and appeared to devote all his time to work and family. Neighbors and colleagues adored him, and he always seemed to be a man in control. A big house on a quiet street, a tidy garden, and every morning, Jake kissed his wife before heading to work. All of this painted the picture of a happy family. But that was only on the surface. No one in town suspected that behind this perfect facade lay a dark secret. Jake had another family in a different town, just a few hours' drive away. There, Lauren waited for him, a woman who believed Jake was her husband and the father of her young son. Unlike Katie, Lauren knew Jake as a successful businessman who often went on business trips, but always returned with a smile and gifts for their child. Jake carefully concealed this double life. He managed his time with cold precision, like a chess master calculating moves several steps ahead. Every trip, every phone call was meticulously planned to avoid leaving any traces that could raise suspicions. No one asked too many questions, and Jake did everything possible to ensure that neither wife ever learned of the other's existence. Lauren believed that his frequent absences were due to his work and the growth of their family business. But there was something much darker lurking in that business. Unbeknownst to Lauren, she was running a company Jake used for money laundering. Their shared business had become a tool to cover up his criminal operations, large-scale financial fraud, shady deals, and illegal contracts. On the surface, the business appeared to be thriving, but in reality, it was just a front masking Jake's criminal schemes that fueled his secret life. Lauren's house had a cozy living room filled with photos of their young son and family portraits. She loved capturing happy moments with Jake, unaware of his real dealings. She believed her life was stable and secure, and to her, Jake was a reliable partner and protector. Occasionally, she would wonder why Jake spent so much time away, but he always had an excuse. We need to work harder to secure our son's future. Meanwhile, Katie noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Life with Jake, in her eyes, was full of family joys. Morning breakfasts, weekend walks with the kids, and always perfect holidays. Jake wasn't just a loving husband. He was a devoted father who never missed a school event or family trip. However, as his business trips became more frequent, she began to wonder if he was too caught up in his work. But every time doubts crept in, Jake would return home with gifts for the children and kind words that erased all her concerns. As is often the case, perfect pictures hide deep cracks. Jake expertly played on the emotions of both women, creating the illusion of stability, love, and loyalty. But inside his mind, paranoia was growing, and so was a plan to keep his criminal schemes hidden as long as neither of his two worlds discovered the other. Jake's double life began to weigh on him more than ever. He increasingly felt that things were spiraling out of control. The internal pressure became so intense that his behavior toward both wives started to change. He could no longer manage his two lives as smoothly as before. His flawless facade began to crack, and he realized that to keep everything in place, he not only had to hide the truth but also manipulate the people around him. Katie, Jake's first wife, started noticing troubling signs. Jake disappeared more often, his trips lasted longer, and when he returned, he seemed more distant. She began asking questions about his work, about why he needed to spend so much time away from home. Whenever Katie voiced her concerns, Jake skillfully used gaslighting to undermine her confidence and make her doubt her own observations. "Are you serious?" he'd say with a tone of bewilderment when she once asked why his phone had been off for hours. "You're being paranoid, Katie. I'm working to provide for our family. Is that a bad thing?" Jake began using phrases like this more frequently. He planted the idea in her mind that her suspicions were baseless. Any attempt Katie made to clarify the situation, he turned back on her. He told her she was just tired or too worried about the kids, suggesting she needed more rest and shouldn't dwell on such trivial matters. "You're becoming so anxious," Jake would say in a calm, almost caring tone. "Maybe you should spend more time with your friends. Everything's fine." Katie started to believe her worries were unfounded, but deep down, she couldn't shake the growing feeling that her husband was hiding something serious. At the same time, Things began to change in Lauren's life as well. She was deeply involved in running the business she and Jake had built together. But slowly, things started to feel off. The accounting showed suspiciously high revenues, bills in her name began arriving with errors, and clients they had never worked with started depositing large sums of money. Lauren tried to reach out to Jake, but he always assured her that everything was under control. His voice on the phone remained confident, but she noticed more and more that he seemed cold and distant. She began to suspect that Jake wasn't telling her everything about the business. However, despite all the signs, Lauren couldn't believe her husband was involved in anything illegal. She thought perhaps the issues were due to internal financial errors or unscrupulous employees. One day, while walking past Jake's desk, Lauren noticed a folder with documents she hadn't seen before. Among the usual reports and invoices were strange bank statements for offshore accounts. She wanted to discuss it with Jake, but changed her mind, convincing herself not to bother him while he was busy on another trip. As Jake struggled with the internal tension of maintaining the illusion of control, a new threat appeared on the horizon. His longtime criminal partner, Victor Grayson, began to suspect that Jake was no longer as reliable as he once was. Victor was a man who always questioned the loyalty of those who worked with him. His instincts never failed him. He knew Jake was hiding something far bigger than just his money laundering schemes. Victor had tried several times to meet with Jake in person, but Jake always found excuses, citing family problems. Victor sensed that Jake was hiding something not just from his wives, but from him as well. In a world where lies and betrayals were commonplace, such signals didn't go unnoticed. "You're getting distracted, Jake," Victor had said one day, his eyes boring into Jake's as they finally met in a dark room in one of Victor's underground clubs. "If you can't keep things under control, I'll find someone who can." Jake knew his position was in danger. He had to maintain his loyalty to Victor while trying to hide his personal problems with both families. The tension in this conflict was growing, and mistakes were becoming more likely. By March 2016, Jake found himself trapped in his own games. Katie grew more suspicious of his fidelity, and Lauren, without even knowing it, had become entangled in his criminal schemes. Victor started watching Jake's every move, suspecting that he might fail him. Against this backdrop, the delicate balance Jake had maintained for years began to collapse. In June 2016, Lauren's life, which had once seemed stable and under control, rapidly unraveled. The business she managed with Jake suddenly turned into a trap. It all started when Victor Grayson, Jake's criminal partner, turned his attention to Lauren. Victor had always been a suspicious man, and his concerns about Jake had been growing. He sensed that Jake was no longer managing things with the same confidence. His carelessness in his personal life had become an obvious threat to the entire criminal network. Victor knew that to control Jake, he had to target the weak link, Lauren. One night, Lauren returned home late after a long day of work. Everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, and her son was already asleep. But on the kitchen table, something strange awaited her, an unsigned envelope. Inside, Lauren found photographs of her business accounts, receipts for transfers, and copies of documents with her signature. Attached to each of these documents were notes with suspicious comments, hinting at her involvement in money laundering. She froze, realizing that these documents could destroy not only her reputation but her entire life. The next morning, she received her first call from Victor. His voice was cold and calm, as if he already knew she wouldn't be able to resist. "Do you know what I've found, Lauren?" he said. "Those documents? They could seriously hurt your business and your freedom." Lauren gripped the phone tightly, her heart racing. "I don't understand what you're talking about," she replied, trying to keep a steady tone, but her voice trembled. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Victor continued. "You have a choice. You start cooperating with me, or I'll hand these papers over to the police. You wouldn't want your son growing up without a mother, would you?" The blackmail was clear. Victor knew Lauren had no idea how deep she was involved in Jake's criminal dealings. He exploited her ignorance and fear to gain control over her and, through her, over Jake. Now she was on the hook, and Victor began his game. From that moment on, Lauren's life descended into chaos. She couldn't trust anyone. It felt like danger lurked around every corner. Victor's voice echoed in her mind, "You can't escape. She began noticing strange things. It seemed like someone was watching her. Every time she left the house, it felt like someone was hiding in the shadows. She caught glimpses of strangers on the street, her anxiety growing. She started checking her mail, computer, and phone, making sure there were no signs that someone had hacked them or was monitoring her actions. At night, it became hard for her to sleep. She would often wake up in a cold sweat, filled with anxiety and fear that someone was about to break into her home. Lauren was too afraid to talk to Jake about it. She began to suspect that he was involved in the conspiracy. Victor continued to pressure her, repeatedly hinting that Jake knew more than he was letting on. "You do realize your husband is part of all this, don't you?" Victor said during another phone call. "He's not who he seems, Lauren. He knows just how far things have gone. And if you go against me, he definitely won't be on your side." These words ate away at her. Victor was expertly manipulating her fears, pushing her toward the belief that Jake not only knew what was happening, but had intentionally dragged her into his dark dealings. Now, it seemed like she couldn't trust the one person who had always been her support. While Lauren wrestled with her growing paranoia and the pressure from Victor, Katie, Jake's first wife, had begun piecing the puzzle together on her own. Her investigation started with small details. Strange bills she found among his papers, conversations he tried to hide. Soon, Katie stumbled upon something that completely changed her perspective, proof of Jake's second family. It was a small letter, forgotten on the back seat of the car. In it, Lauren, his second wife, wrote to Jake about daily life, their son missing him. At first, Katie couldn't believe her eyes. Who was this woman? Why was Jake living a double life? Her heart clenched in horror and rage as she realized that Jake had been deceiving her for years. Katie didn't immediately confront Jake. She decided to dig deeper before making her move. She began following him, checking his phone, reading his messages, and uncovering more evidence of his betrayal and infidelity. Her world was falling apart, but she held on, planning her next steps carefully. Now, both of Jake's wives were on the brink. Lauren, trapped in a web of criminal blackmail, and Katie, slowly unraveling his double life. Tensions were rising, and soon, it was all bound to explode. By August 2016, the situation around Jake Miller was spiraling out of control. The life that once seemed perfect and well-organized had become a tangled mess of lies, manipulation, and criminal schemes. His two families, which he had successfully kept hidden from each other for so long, had now become targets of threats from his criminal partners. The people who once worked with him were now applying pressure, demanding more involvement, more risk, and increasingly dangerous operations. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. His wives' and children's lives were at risk. The criminal operations Jake was running through Lauren's business were becoming more complex. Victor Grayson and his partners demanded new money laundering schemes and larger-scale deals. Jake, who once had a handle on every detail, now felt his partners growing suspicious of his loyalty. Victor made it clear that any mistake or attempt to back out would put both of his families in danger. "You're in too deep now," Victor said during one of their meetings in a dimly lit room that served as their operations base. "If any of us goes down, you'll take more than just your life with you. Remember that, Jake." Each of Victor's words was cold and calculated, like a dagger sinking deeper into Jake's mind. With every passing day, the pressure mounted, and now Jake knew that even the smallest mistake could cost him everything. Jake found himself facing an impossible choice. He knew his criminal connections had grown so deep that escaping them seemed nearly impossible without severe consequences. On one hand, he wanted to save both families from the inevitable collapse. On the other, leaving the game would mean betraying the criminal network, which would lead to immediate retribution against his loved ones. Each time he returned home to Katie, he saw her warm smile, their children playing in the living room, but inside, he felt an increasing sense of guilt and fear. Time spent with Katie and the kids felt like a slow-motion nightmare. He knew it could all disappear in an instant. But when he was with Lauren, he sensed that she was on the verge of discovering how deeply she had been pulled into his dirty business. She wasn't just his wife. She was part of his criminal operation, making her a potential victim. Jake's internal world was collapsing. He woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, seeing visions of both his families being destroyed because he couldn't protect them. He felt like a man caught in a trap with no way out, and every step he took brought him closer to an inevitable tragedy. Under the pressure of Victor's blackmail, Lauren began to act more aggressively. She felt the need to protect her business and her son at all costs, and slowly, her fears turned into determination. Lauren started tracking the company's financial transactions, searching for any clues that could help her escape the trap she had been pulled into. She began demanding explanations from Jake, but he continued to dodge the conversations, which only fueled her suspicions. "Why won't you tell me anything?" she asked him one day, standing in the doorway of his office. Her voice was tense, and her eyes burned with resolve. "You're hiding something. I know it." Jake tried to steer the conversation away, turning it toward business issues, but Lauren didn't back down. She had grown suspicious and started taking matters into her own hands. In her mind, a plan was forming. If Jake wouldn't protect her, she would find her own way out of the situation. Meanwhile, Katie began taking more drastic measures. She dived deeper into her own investigation, uncovering more evidence of her husband's double life. She found more documents and receipts that didn't match his stories about work. Her suspicions had turned into certainty. She knew Jake was leading a double life. Now, she sought a way to prove it and extricate herself from his lies without destroying her life and her children's lives. She started following his movements, going through his emails and messages. Every new discovery drove her to act more desperately. She began monitoring his calls and trips, searching for a single thread that would lead her to the full extent of her husband's deception. Katie no longer just suspected. She was ready to expose him. She began calling companies Jake supposedly worked with to understand the nature of his dealings. She felt that his stories about the business didn't match reality. Katie even hired a private investigator to find out more about his connections and trips. She started gathering materials she could use against him, preparing to protect herself and her children. August 2016 was a month of constant tension for Jake. Every move, every phone call, and every meeting felt like they were teetering on the edge of disaster. Victor continued to apply pressure, Lauren became more aggressive, and Katie methodically collected evidence, preparing to reveal his secrets. Each night, as Jake lay down to sleep, he knew that he could wake up to a world where everything he had built would collapse in an instant. By September 2016, the tension surrounding Jake Miller, his two families, and his criminal activities had reached its breaking point. The situation, which had been simmering beneath the surface for so long, was now ready to explode. But this time, the focus shifted from Jake to his wives, Katie and Lauren, who, unaware of each other, were beginning to sense that something was terribly wrong. Katie felt trapped in her own life. She had gathered enough evidence of her husband's double life and was increasingly convinced that his actions were far more dangerous than mere infidelity. Her suspicions about his secrets had turned into full-blown paranoia. Each day, when Jake left the house, she felt like someone was watching her. She noticed strangers lingering near the house or walking by slower than usual. She even began to suspect that her phone was being tapped. Her thoughts became increasingly tangled. She began to think that not only was Jake leading a double life, but that it might be far more dangerous than she had imagined. Her fears deepened when she found a bill in Jake's car under the name Lauren. That name triggered an investigation that would eventually lead her to startling revelations. Lauren? Who is she? Katie whispered to herself as she studied the documents found in Jake's things. She felt like that name kept coming up, connected to the darker side of Jake's life. Katie began tracking down this woman, trying to find her on social media and other platforms. A theory was forming in her mind that Lauren wasn't just another woman in Jake's life, but a part of a much larger conspiracy. Katie concluded that Lauren was involved in Jake's criminal operations and was possibly using him for her own purposes. Each day, her thoughts grew darker. She decided she needed to contact Lauren herself to uncover the truth. Katie began preparing for the confrontation, determined to expose her, believing that it would provide the answers to all her questions. But fear was building. She wondered if Lauren's involvement in something dangerous might put her own life in jeopardy. Meanwhile, Lauren was experiencing something similar. Victor's blackmail hadn't stopped. She felt increasingly vulnerable with each passing day, and the fear for her future and her son's safety kept growing. Her mind was overwhelmed with threats and the anxiety that her life could collapse at any moment. She began noticing little things that had never worried her before. Suspicious calls, strange messages, unexplained transactions. Victor continued to apply pressure, forcing her to work for him, and hinted that someone was watching her. Lauren, too, started to believe she was being watched. She felt the presence of unseen eyes following her every move. She grew anxious, jumping at every knock on the door. One day, she found a photograph of her son in an unmarked envelope, and that's when she realized someone was watching her family. This fear led her to believe that the danger didn't just come from Victor, but from people she hadn't even suspected. What if it's not just Victor? Lauren thought, flipping through the reports of financial transactions she had been pulled into. What if someone else is involved in this? At that moment, Lauren began to suspect that Katie, whose existence she soon discovered, was somehow connected to her troubles. Her mind was so clouded with fear that she started seeing Katie as a threat. She believed that Katie might be a spy, hired by Victor to monitor her and her dealings. At the same time, Katie, now fully determined to expose Lauren, also began acting aggressively. She was tracking Lauren's movements, watching her house, trying to understand how deep she was involved in Jake's life. This clash between the two women, each seeing the other as the enemy, began escalating into a covert war. Neither of them, knowing the true intentions of the other, continued to act, driven by fear and suspicion. Lauren became more evasive with Jake, suspecting that he, too, could be involved in the conspiracy against her. Meanwhile, Katie kept digging for evidence to expose Lauren and ensure her own safety. Lauren stopped trusting anyone, including Jake, and now saw Katie as a threat that could destroy her life. Victor, sensing the tension and exploiting Lauren's paranoia, continued to stoke the atmosphere of fear. He skillfully manipulated both women, knowing that their conflict could give him full control over Jake and his business. By September 2016, both of Jake's wives had become victims of their own fears and suspicions. Lauren, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, saw Katie as the main threat to her peace of mind. Katie, on the other hand, viewed Lauren as an obstacle standing in the way of the truth and the safety of her children. Their paths were bound to cross, and it was clear that their covert war would soon erupt into an open confrontation. Neither of them could have imagined how far they would go in their desperation to survive the situation. October 2016 was the month when all the threads of Jake Miller's life finally became hopelessly tangled, and his carefully crafted double life collapsed. Every mistake, every lie he had told his wives, led to the breaking point where fear, paranoia, and distrust collided. Now everything depended on how events would unfold, but Jake no longer had control over anything. At this point, Jake realized he could no longer manage the situation. His world was falling apart under pressure from both sides. His criminal partners were becoming a threat to his life and the lives of his wives, and Lauren and Katie, each in their own way, were on the brink of a mental breakdown. Jake came to what seemed, in his mind, the only logical conclusion. To save himself and his criminal empire, he needed to get rid of both women. For Jake, this decision was one of desperation. He began formulating a plan to eliminate Katie and Lauren in a way that would leave no trace leading back to him. He knew that if even one of them decided to reveal his secrets, his entire life, both criminal and personal, would fall apart. But that plan never materialized, as circumstances took a different turn. Everything started to unravel on the day when Katie and Lauren finally came face to face. At first, it seemed like an insignificant, almost accidental encounter. Katie had been following Lauren for some time, knowing she was the second woman in Jake's life. She wanted to confront her and get answers, but she wasn't prepared for what would come next. Lauren, on her side, had long felt the threat from the unknown woman and now met her in person. Katie, consumed by suspicions and fear for her family, was ready for a blunt conversation. She found Lauren at her home, and from the beginning, the atmosphere was tense. Katie came with the intention of revealing the truth and confronting Lauren with the facts she had discovered. But the meeting didn't go as planned. Lauren, under constant pressure from Victor's blackmail, saw Katie's arrival as a direct threat to her and her son's safety. When Katie entered Lauren's home, their conversation quickly escalated into conflict. Katie, losing control, began accusing Lauren of dragging Jake into criminal dealings. Her words were filled with anger and pain. "You know who he really is, don't you?" Katie shouted, her hands shaking with emotion. "You've been part of this from the very beginning." Lauren, frightened and shocked, began to defend herself. She didn't understand what Katie was talking about, but her mind was already clouded by fear, and she believed Katie had been sent by her enemies. She felt cornered, as if the whole world was closing in on her. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lauren yelled, her voice trembling with panic. "You're wrong. You're the one who ruined everything." The tension escalated. Each woman viewed the other as the enemy. At that moment, their emotions took over logic. Suddenly, in a state of complete desperation and fear, Lauren grabbed the nearest object, a heavy statue from the shelf. Her hands shook as she raised it to defend herself. Katie, seeing this, stepped forward, trying to stop Lauren, but it only worsened the situation. In panic, Lauren swung the statue. The entire scene unfolded in a matter of seconds. The statue hit Katie in the head with a sickening thud. Katie collapsed to the floor, blood slowly pooling around her head. Lauren, realizing what had just happened, froze, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with horror. Meanwhile, Jake had arrived at Lauren's house to meet with her and discuss their next steps. He didn't expect to witness a tragedy unfolding. As he entered the house, the first thing he saw was Katie's body lying on the floor and Lauren standing over her, holding the bloodied statue. He froze in the doorway, watching as the life he had so carefully built fell apart in an instant. Now it was all over. He could no longer control the situation, and all he could do was watch the consequences of his own actions. Jake didn't intervene. He didn't take a single step to help Katie or stop Lauren. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. How he had destroyed the lives of both women, how his criminal schemes had led to the tragedy he couldn't prevent. Lauren, realizing Jake's presence, looked at him with desperation in her eyes, as if hoping he would help. But Jake was already broken. He knew that he had lost everything he had fought so hard for. Katie's death became the climax of everything. Lauren hadn't fully realized that her actions had resulted in Katie's death. She was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and this wasn't a cold-blooded murder. It was an act of desperation, the result of the psychological game they had all been caught in. Jake, standing nearby, could no longer save anyone, including himself. After Katie's murder in Lauren's home, events quickly spiraled out of control. Lauren, overwhelmed by the horror of what had happened, sank into deep despair. She couldn't believe she had killed someone with her own hands. Jake, paralyzed with shock, tried to take control of the situation, but his mind was in chaos. He no longer knew how to handle the situation or what to do next. Guilty of causing the death of one of his wives through his secret life, he was forced to take extreme measures. Lauren stood over Katie's body, unable to move. Her mind was consumed by chaos. She had just killed someone, and now she couldn't understand how to move forward. Every moment after that felt unreal. She tried to justify her actions in her mind. It was self-defense. She was only trying to protect herself and her child. But the thought that she had killed Katie gnawed at her, eroding her sanity. "This can't have happened," she kept repeating to herself. "It's a mistake." But when she looked at the bloodied statue in her hands, she knew there was no going back. Lauren realized her life would never be the same. She had lost control and was now on the verge of a complete breakdown. In panic, she begged Jake to do something, but he just stood there silently, watching, unsure of how to proceed. Jake, finally understanding that he could no longer stand idly by, began to act. He knew that if he left things as they were, the police would quickly connect him to the murder. He began thinking coldly about how to cover up the tracks, how to dispose of Katie's body, and how to eliminate any evidence that could reveal his double life. He forced Lauren to clean up the blood and dispose of the statue, the murder weapon. "We can't leave any traces." His voice was cold, almost mechanical. "No one can know she was here." He tried to maintain control over the situation, but inside, he was burning with fear and guilt. His plans were falling apart one after the other, and reality was slipping further out of control. However, he didn't know that things weren't going according to his plan. Soon, another figure would emerge, one that would completely destroy his life. Meanwhile, Victor Grayson, Jake's criminal partner, had been closely monitoring his actions. He had long suspected that something was wrong and finally decided to step in. Victor knew that Jake was no longer in control of the situation and feared that his mistakes could lead to the exposure of their entire criminal network. To Victor, Lauren had always been a weak link, and now that she had caused a murder, he realized she had to be eliminated. Victor appeared at Lauren's house unexpectedly, as always, without warnings or unnecessary words. When he saw Lauren, overwhelmed with panic and in a state of complete shock, he knew she was no longer of any use to their criminal scheme. She had become a liability to the entire organization. "She's no longer needed," Victor said coldly, looking at Jake, who couldn't believe what was happening. "She's the weak link." Before Jake could react, Victor coldly killed Lauren. The entire scene unfolded in seconds. One shot, and Lauren fell, not even realizing what had happened. Jake stood, staring at the body of his second wife, knowing that everything had finally spiraled out of his control. After Victor killed Lauren, something inside Jake snapped. He could no longer contain his anger, despair, and guilt. Everything he had fought for had crumbled right before his eyes. In a moment of sheer madness, consumed by rage, he grabbed Victor's gun and pointed it at his longtime partner. "You ruined everything," Jake growled, his voice filled with fury and pain. "I won't let you walk away." Victor, realizing that Jake was no longer following orders, didn't have time to react. Jake fired multiple shots, his hands trembling, but his face remained cold. Victor fell to the floor, his body lying motionless next to Lauren's. Now, Jake was alone. His life with Katie and Lauren was gone. His criminal activities, which he had hidden for so long, had led to the death of everyone he had ever loved. Left in an empty house with two bodies, he realized that his life had been destroyed, completely and irreversibly. Once the dust settled, Jake knew his time was up. He sat among the bodies of those he once loved, understanding that his only options were to surrender to the authorities or end this nightmare another way. He was left to choose between running or full exposure. October 2016 marked the end not just of Jake Miller's double life, but of Jake Miller himself. By December 2016, Jake Miller's life had become an endless nightmare. The criminal network he had spent years building was exposed. After the murders of Lauren and Victor, he was under investigation, and soon the police unraveled every detail of his double life. All his secrets were laid bare, from his illegal activities to the two families he had worked so hard to conceal. Now, with Jake imprisoned, stripped of everything he had fought for, his physical and mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. Jake's arrest came almost immediately after the murders. After neighbors called the police, having heard gunshots from Lauren's house, Jake made no attempt to flee. He knew he could no longer escape justice. When the police entered the house, they found him sitting among the bodies of Lauren and Victor, his eyes vacant, his face emotionless. He didn't resist the arrest. What remained of Jake was a shell of the man who once controlled everything but had now lost all power over his own fate. As they took him to the station, Jake remained silent. He didn't say a word, his mind wandering far away, as if he had already stopped perceiving reality. The investigation quickly revealed Jake's involvement in a large criminal network, laundering money through his business. Documents found in the house and witness testimonies confirmed his role, but it didn't end there. Soon it became clear that he had been living a double life with two families, which only intensified the public outrage surrounding the case. Locked in his prison cell, Jake began to sink deeper into his own nightmares. His psyche had been shattered by the events of the past few months. The constant anxiety and hidden fears he had lived with now overwhelmed him completely. At first, he would see them only in his dreams, Lauren and Katie appearing before him, reminding him of the horrors he had caused. But soon, these visions became far more real. Jake felt as though Lauren and Katie continued to haunt him even after their deaths. Their faces appeared in every corner of his mind. He saw Lauren, coldly smiling, standing in the corner of his cell, her eyes filled with hatred and pain. Sometimes she seemed to be judging him, other times begging him to explain why he had done what he did. Katie came to him in his dreams, crying and accusing him of betrayal. She symbolized everything Jake had destroyed with his own hands, and her presence became an unbearable burden on his mind. He woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But the line between reality and hallucinations began to blur. "You destroyed our lives," a voice whispered to him each night. "You can never escape this." By December, his mental state had completely unraveled. Jake began hearing voices that seemed to come from everywhere. These voices followed him when he sat alone in his cell. They sounded as if the very walls of the prison were speaking to him in the voices of Lauren and Katie. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him, judging him for every mistake he had made. Every day, his mind drifted further from reality. He stopped eating, refusing the food the guards brought him. His body became weak and emaciated. But the worst part was that he started losing the ability to distinguish between his thoughts and his hallucinations. Lauren and Katie were no longer just nightmares. They had become part of his new reality, a reality he lived in every day. By late December, Jake had fully descended into the depths of his own hallucinations. He no longer spoke to the guards or other inmates. When someone approached his cell, he stared right through them, as if they didn't exist. His mind had created a new world for him, a world in which he was alone with the ghosts of those he had betrayed. He saw Lauren and Katie sitting across from him, whispering to each other, discussing his fate. Sometimes they came closer, whispering accusations in his ear. Other times, they simply stood silently, watching him suffer. Jake tried to talk to them, but he received no answers, only whispers and silence. His life had become an endless torture, where he was trapped in his own fears and memories. It felt to him as if every night he was reliving the moment Lauren killed Katie, and then the moment he killed Victor. In his mind, these moments were twisted and replayed over and over, each time becoming more horrific and distorted. In the final days of December, Jake completely lost touch with reality. The guards found him sitting on the floor of his cell, muttering incoherently about Lauren and Katie. He looked gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his body trembling. His mind had been destroyed to the point where he could no longer tell what was happening in his head and what was real. The only thing left of Jake Miller was a man forever imprisoned in his own nightmares.